Good morning and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode as the United States recalibrates its strategic posture towards Europe amidst the war in Ukraine, escalating tensions in the Middle East, and intensifying great power competition. Critical questions emerge not only about security architecture, but also about fiscal sustainability, energy markets, industrial capacity, and the long term foundations of transatlantic economic cooperation. Today, we are honored to be joined by Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli, President of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and one of United Kingdom's most distinguished economists. With decades of experience in macroeconomic policy, public finance, and institutional leadership, Professor Muscatelli brings a deeply informed perspective on how geopolitical shocks translate into economic consequences, shaping markets, public finances, and the future trajectory of the transatlantic relationships. Thank you so much, sir, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here, Ridvay. Thank you.
So, to begin with, since 2022, the United States has deepened its security commitments to Europe while maintaining domestic fiscal pressures. So, from a macroeconomic standpoint, is this posture sustainable, and how do markets interpret America's long-term capacity to underwrite European security?
Well, it's a really interesting question. And of course, since 2022, we've been through a little bit of a recalibration as well as kind of continuity. Obviously, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 triggered what seemed to be almost a renaissance in the transatlantic relationship. It was under the Biden administration. There was very much a recommitment to that collective defense. There was very much a joint view of the NATO alliance as Ukraine as a test of the liberal order and the need to defend the liberal order. The enlargement of NATO itself actually was a signal of a reinvigorating alliance. However, at the same time, you saw the US reiterating its need for the European countries, members of NATO, to make a contribution to that, a burden share, if you like, and we might get onto some of that, and a kind of pivot towards the Indo-Pacific. Very much, if you look at the 2022 National Defense Strategy for the US, very much emphasizing, China as the pacing challenge. I think that was the expression used. So even before the Trump administration took place, you see a bit of a balance there between continuity and kind of recalibration. But of course, with the re-election of President Trump, we've seen a really major turn, and the US, particularly in the 2025 National Security Strategy, completely recalibrating transatlantic relations around transactionalist lines. Europe needs to pay more for defense. It needs to take charge in terms of looking at the future peace in Ukraine. It needs to liberalize trade in America's favor, and we'll get into some of these things, I'm sure. And therefore, that's very much, I think, since 2024-25, we've seen a complete recalibration of that. And I think that challenges certainly the European arm of NATO. Now, the US, of course, is very committed to increased spending. And back to your question, what will that do in terms of kind of fiscal sustainability? The US has one of the largest debt to GDP ratios. And there's real concerns at the moment around whether that is sustainable, especially since this administration seems to be less concerned about fiscal rectitude, and also because it takes a much looser view around monetary policy. So, what all this will do to the world economy is a really interesting question, and of course, it won't unfold in simply a few months. And following that recalibration, it will take a little longer than that.
Now coming towards Europe, so European states are also increasing defense spending significantly. So what are the economic trade-offs for European governments already facing high debt levels, demographic pressures, and slow growth? Does this movement accelerate physical integration within Europe, or you see this going somewhere else?
Oh gosh, it's a really complicated question, and so absolutely, there's big debates taking place within Europe, and as you say, and just again for listeners' views, the pandemic has had a huge impact on Europe's fiscal overhang, or indeed in most advanced economies. So we've moved as a set of European countries, and I include the UK in this, even though we're outside the EU. from a situation where we roughly had 60 to 70%, in some cases of some countries, debt to GDP ratios, to a situation where, many countries, the UK, France, Italy, have debt to GDP ratios which are historically high, certainly since the Second World War. And not only that, what makes it more complicated is the fact that real interest rates have actually gone up from a situation where they were very, very low post-great financial crisis to a situation where they're higher than the underlying growth rate, as you point out. Now, that makes debt inherently non-sustainable. If you have an interest rate which is higher than the rate of growth, essentially it means the debt will grow relative to GDP. And at the moment, I think we're seeing a bit of we've seen this playing out around the kind of fractured politics in Europe. We've seen in a number of countries those political parties that are emphasizing they need to maintain the kind of welfare state that has been put together since 1945. It's been built up, to those that really re-emphasize the need for Europe to reboot growth. And of course, that's not easy, because we've seen across European countries a much lower growth since 2007-8. And what's that based on? I think that's going to be based on largely around trying to reboot innovation. It's largely around trying to make bigger public investments around net zero, which hopefully will spark innovation in related sectors. And we're seeing that kind of debate unfolding. Now, how will that play out? It really is difficult to say. I mean, you've seen this in the UK, and in one particular European country, of course, in the UK. Over the last year and a half, since the election of a Labour government, we've seen really major debates as to whether you need to have major reforms of social welfare, which will reduce spend, at the same time as a more proactive public investment policy, which will hopefully crowd in private investment and reboot growth. But at the same time, we've also seen resistance to that from the political left. So there's a real debate going on at the moment, and I'm not sure how this will be resolved, I'll be honest, at this point in time. I think we're seeing more political fracture as a result.
Yeah, coming to Europe's energy market. So given Europe's recent energy shock after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how vulnerable is the global economy to renewed energy instability in the Middle East? Could this reignite inflationary pressures, such as central banks' attempt to stabilize growth? And how do you see this whole energy sector in this whole scenario?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question again, because before this latest crisis in the Middle East, if you look at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank's updated projections, which were both produced in January of this year, basically they were both noting that the global economy has remained actually quite surprisingly resilient, despite those trade tensions I mentioned earlier between the US and the rest of the world. Essentially, the IMF was projecting a slight increase in growth for 2026. I think they were projecting around 3.3%. The World Bank was a little more cautious, essentially expecting a modest slowdown from a surprisingly resilient 2.7% growth in the world economy in 2025 to around 2.6% in 2026. And I think most people saw kind of inflation as projected to decline. The IMF saw that world inflation falling slightly to 3.8%, and the World Bank, I think, to about 3.1%, perhaps with US inflation kind of expected to return to target more gradually than another region. However, as you pointed out, all that was based on a background assumption in their modeling forecasts, which suggested that Brent crude, or the oil price, was going to be roughly around $60 per barrel in 2026 due to supply outpacing demand. Now, however, what we've seen over the last few days with conflict over Iran is the possibility that world supplies will be cut off, at least those supplies flowing through the Straits of Hormuz, which is around a quarter of oil capacity, oil production in the world. And, although some parts of the world, the United States is quite self-sufficient, it doesn't depend on those flows, you cannot escape the impact on the oil price. And we've already seen the oil price, I think, this morning kind of going up by 10% simply on reacting to what's happened in the Middle East. So that could absolutely have another suddenly inflationary shock. It's not going to be a huge inflationary shock if that's where it sits. And of course, it will depend how long it takes for this particular conflict to wind up. Is it going to be a matter of a few weeks, 2-3 weeks, in which case the oil shock will subside, or is it something more persistent? And I think that is the crucial question at the moment in terms of what happens to inflation as a result of the US Israel-Iran conflict.
Yeah, adding up to this, so how do sudden military escalations such as the US strikes on Iran transmit through global markets? In particular, what are the likely channels through which oil price volatility or investor uncertainty affect transatlantic economies at this stage?
Well, the main channel is through the price, and as I said, one of the interesting things, if you look at where the flow of Gulf oil tends to go, a lot of it tends to go to the Indo-Pacific area or to Europe. Not as much goes to the US, but it doesn't matter because there's a global market for oil. So even the US will feel the consequences if this 10% increase were to A, persist, or B, perhaps get worse. That's one particular channel. And the other channel, obviously, is what it does to confidence, the business confidence. The Gulf region is a very dynamic part of the world economy. We've seen over the last few years just how much investment has been happening there. It's attracted, and inevitably, an area that was considered to be safe and growing and open to trade and to economic activity all of a sudden is under military threat, and that will have an impact on business confidence as well. So and these effects are more difficult to quantify. That channel is more difficult to quantify, but it will without a doubt have an effect. And then finally, I think, again, really difficult to know how this will play out because it depends to some extent whether the conflict is short-lasting or whether it's longer-lasting, is what will this do to some of the discussions around trade? 2024-25 saw a really difficult discussion around trade. Conflict even within the US because we've recently had a Supreme Court judgment against the administration on its initial round of tariffs. Will what's happening in the Middle East influence and make it even more acrimonious, that discussion around global trade? Who knows? And then finally, of course, the other channel is what will it do to European considerations around what we were discussing earlier, which is around the future of the Transatlantic Alliance, because again, we're seeing even different responses from the European arm of NATO over the last few days since the conflict broke out. Exactly how they want to respond to this. So many impacts from this rather astounding escalation, which will play out in the global economy.
Yeah, coming back to Europe, so there is a growing emphasis on strengthening defense industrial capacity across Europe and also in the United Kingdom. So do you see this purely a security imperative or also as a form of industrial policy that could reshape transatlantic supply chains and also economic competitiveness?
I think the latter very much so. Well, first of all, there is a big economic adjustment issue because if we take the kind of as aspirational 5% target of expenditure for NATO, which has been kind of at least in principle agreed by 2035, to try and carve out 5% of GDP within very tight public finances that we were discussing earlier is a really big challenge. To do that without a major increase either in taxation or in cuts elsewhere in fiscal spending is going to be really, really difficult. And it's a massive challenge. We haven't seen levels of spending on defense of that type since the Cold War ended. But as you say, there's a wider issue there. What will it do to sort of other matters as well in terms of considerations for industrial policy? So in the UK but also in Europe, we're seeing an attempt to try and gain some advantage from this pivot towards defence industries. And there's no doubt that, if you look at, technological development, whether that is in areas like electronics or quantum technologies or indeed, autonomous vehicles, there are huge crossover, because most of these sectors are dual technology sectors where there's civilian applications as well as military applications. So there's no doubt in my mind that most European countries, most Western countries, will see this as a dual action. They will see the potential civilian benefit and economic benefits of investing here. And sorry, not only Western economies, of course, globally, you'll see many other emerging economies wanting to move at speed into this area, because one of the things we've seen around the conflict in Ukraine, and we're seeing now in the conflict in the Gulf, is actually, the development of new means of carrying out warfare, autonomous vehicles, etc., which until the Ukraine war we weren't really seeing as much. So there's clear spillover effects there on economic activity, and there's no doubt I think most countries will try and gain advantage from that.
Yeah, from a macro perspective, are we moving towards a more securitized economic order, where trade, technology, energy, and finances are increasingly shaped by geopolitical alignment? And if so, does this mark a structural transformation of the liberal economic system that has underpinned transatlantic relations for decades?
So the answer is yes, absolutely, and we're seeing that playing out already. We're seeing the way in which countries are thinking about in terms of trade deals shaped by security considerations, and and that security considerations. These security considerations go all the way from securing supply and value chains, all the way to securing technology and making sure that technology doesn't is protected. Having said all that, it's really difficult to do that in a globalized world. If you look at the way in which the world economy was shaped by the Cold War, we saw effectively two blocks emerging since 1945, well, since immediately after 1945, where these blocks did not trade very much with each other, and technology transfer was very, very limited between them. And that's not the world we inhabit now. There are many economies, especially in Asia, that look both to the China-Russia bloc, and at the same time look towards the US-Western bloc. And of course, they trade with both. They will try and maintain trade with both. They will try and resist any attempt to effectively geopolitically divide or separate out the world into separate trade and technology blocs. So, given that, it's a bit more difficult for any particular bloc to try to simply move into protective mode, where you say we're only going to trade with those countries that we share values or share security concerns with. I think that's going to be really, really difficult. So geopolitics will, of course, shape trade and will shape technology transfer. But there will be also many countries that operate in that kind of middle sphere. As I say, many of them in Asia, because they have faced both ways. And I can see that, in a sense, those countries trying to ensure that they can maintain a position that doesn't force them to choose either. So it's a messier world during the Cold War era, where the world simply separated out into two spheres.
Yeah, you talked about economies in Asia. So as we speak, the Canadian Prime Minister is in India, and before that, the French President Emmanuel Macron was also in India, and India and France signed one of the biggest trade deals in the history of Indian defense architecture. So how do you see Western countries reaching out to economies in Asia, particularly India, with the fracture in transatlantic relations after President Trump coming to power? How do you see this equation, and where do you see India in the whole Western economic as well as geopolitical territory?
So India is the star performer in the world economy at the moment, with the slowdown in China due to demographic pressures, but also some of the issues around property overhangs. If you look at the IMF and the World Bank projections for 2026, they both project India growing between 6 and 7%. remaining a top performer despite the trade restrictions that we were discussing earlier and the impact of US actions. So I have absolutely no doubt, and this is a perfect example of what I was discussing earlier. I have no doubt that major European economies like France, Germany, the UK will pivot towards those large dynamic economies like India in Asia that will continue to be dynamic even despite the global economic challenges of the last few years, because they see a real opportunity there to try and offset some of the drag on their own economies, but also because again there's a lot of kind of common interests with India around that kind of security sphere as well. So I have no doubt that India will continue to be a star performer, but also that it will attract those linkages. But frankly, we're also seeing these countries kind of trying to play a mixed strategy vis-a-vis also countries like China as well, because we've seen the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney go to China and say, yes, of course there are some issues here in terms of security, but we want to drive trade. And again, we'll see increasingly middle countries, as I think the description was with when Mark Carney went to visited China, that middle countries trying to not position themselves fully with the US in these trade disputes and these technology disputes. So it's going to be an interesting few years.
Yeah, I would like to conclude the discussion by asking that how would you characterize the current movement in transatlantic relations, especially from the diplomatic point of view? Are we witnessing temporary turbulence or deeper structural shift in the global order?
So that's again a fantastic question. I think overall I would see it as something more permanent, not least because although this particular administration has been a driver of a recalibration in transatlantic relations, there is no guarantee that there will be a reversion back to a different kind of administration. First of all, we'll need to see what happens over the next few years, but also because I think there is the issue of Europe spending more on its own defense. I think will probably something which is crosses bipartisan lines in the US, so I don't see that changing. So I do think that the change in the US strategy towards Europe is one that will probably persist even after the next US presidential elections. And Europe needs to think very carefully about its next step. What we're seeing is that it's demanding this recalibration by the US. I think it's demanding a more capable, a more autonomous Europe, precisely when, as you said earlier, and you asked me about Europe's political capacity, particularly when European political capacity is most constrained by fragmented politics, by decades of industrial underscaling. And so, Europe runs the risk of being squeezed between East and West, and that is a structural issue, not simply one that will revert after the next US presidential elections.
Yeah, Professor Muscatelli, thank you so much for a thoughtful and wide-ranging discussion. Today's conversation highlights how closely security and economics are now intertwined, from defense spending and fiscal pressures to energy markets and global stability. As the transatlantic relationship navigates a period of uncertainty and recalibration, the economic foundations of that partnership will be just as critical as its strategic commitments. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us at Prode. It's been a pleasure to host you here.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.